Joining me right now is North Dakota Senator and member of the Senate Banking Committee, Kevin Cramer. Senator, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. So what are you expecting from Powell today? What do you want to ask him?
Yeah, well, I'm expecting sort of what we heard yesterday, and when you go second, you know, the committee, the banking committee, doing one day after the House committee, you kind of have to get a little bit creative. One of the interesting discussions I thought yesterday in the House committee was centered around sort of workforce and immigration policy. You know, when you look at the barriers to the growth of the economy going forward, it seems like workforce is a pretty big one. We're at a point where we really have a human being shortage, where we're cannibalizing between industries and within industries. So I might dig into that a little bit. Obviously, we're all curious about Basel III and Regulation 2 and the impact that regulation has. And frankly, I thought your previous interview with Anton pretty well covered the most important things in banking and financial services going on.
Yeah, thank you. I think regulation is top of mind for certainly the banking sector, with these expectations of a tighter regulatory framework, even while we continue to see stress in the banking sector, as evidenced by New York Community Bancorp yesterday. Let's talk about President Biden and his role in all of this. He'll deliver the State of the Union address tonight. Your colleague, Alabama Senator Katie Britt, will be delivering the GOP response. The White House put out this statement saying President Biden will highlight that middle-class families deserve further relief from corporate greed and high costs. So, Senator, he's basically blaming all of the failures on corporate greed. Your reaction?
Well, the beautiful thing about this election year is that the contrast between two candidates could not be clearer, because they've both been president, and both of them have a record. And middle-class Americans know which presidency they were better under economically. And middle America and middle-class America were the ones that were left out in previous administrations prior to President Trump, and they're the ones being left out now. And by the White House's own admission, obviously, how they can blame that on greed or on Republicans when they've been controlling the government for the last few years, that the government that raised interest rates and that raised inflation much higher than families' incomes. I don't know how they can lay that on Republicans. And frankly, I don't think it passes a smell test for these very Americans who he says he's going to try to help.
Yeah, we were just talking about that, and I asked the panel here whether or not it's going to fly. Do people really believe it when he blames other people for the inflation situation, which of course skyrocketed to 40-year highs within the last year? It is still up 18% on his watch. Would you attribute this inflation largely to the excessive spending in some regard, $6 trillion in borrowing on his watch?
The very nature of and the very foundation of inflation is when you have too much, too much demand and not enough of supply, or on the money side, too much supply, creating the demand for the products and the supply chain that's broken. The actual description and
inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods.
And so how do you look back when he became president? We were already coming out of the tough economy created by a pandemic, where there was a lot of money flooded, to say the least, into the economy, because we were sort of flying an airplane while we were building it. But then Biden comes into office, and he wants to flood another $2 trillion, all borrowed dollars, when we're already coming into recovery. And that really it was the fuel on the flame, in my view, of inflation. And then you throw on top of that the continued spending, when they used pure partisan politics to pass all of this spending. It's the very definition and the creation, and then you have a broken supply chain at the same time. And so all of these things were under his watch, and by the way, a 100% Democratic government watch.
But you're agreeing to it again, right? I mean, the House passed 6 spending bills to partially fund the government yesterday. Lawmakers combining the funding for 6 federal agencies into the so-called minibus instead of an omnibus. That's worth $460 billion. Now that bill is headed to the Senate. Where does it go from there, Senator? I mean, Speaker Johnson says Republicans are making gradual changes and are making reforms to the funding process. But at the end of the day, you're still working on Nancy Pelosi's budget, aren't you? Kentucky Congressman Thomas Massey wrote this on X. The Republican-led House just passed a minibus that spends tens of billions more than Pelosi's House spent on the same things last year, Senator. You going to agree to that?
No, actually, there's a reduction from the 2023 dollars, an actual reduction. There's a slight increase on defense spending. on the defense side of all of this, including the next minibus that's going to be the bigger challenge, I think, for all of us. So while not where we would be if we were in control, it's certainly an improvement. And frankly, there wasn't regular order, which is always my greatest frustration, but there was more regular order this time than there's been for several years. Now, we didn't take each of them up one at a time, but at least the Appropriations Committee voted them all out in the Senate. These 6 bills passed out of committee by a total of 170 to 1, which means there's strong bipartisan, even very conservative support, as well as obviously Democratic and liberal support. In a divided government, I think is probably the best that we could do.
Well, I guess that is, at the end of the day, where we are. So we'll be watching what happens in the Senate. Real quick before you go, I know you're on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, Senator, and Mark Tepper made a point earlier, and we're going to talk about it in a few minutes, that homelessness is increasing for veterans. How do you feel when you see homelessness increasing for veterans and illegal migrants getting put in these hotels and getting prepaid credit cards?
Well, I think most Americans do. It's a gross injustice. It's a completely upside down set of priorities. It's fueled by the left that
Can you do anything about it?
The borders wide open.
Can you do anything about it?
Oh, sure. Can we? I think one thing we have to do is elect a new president that will secure the border under the very same policies that he did before, that this president has used to open the borders and welcome all of these people in, put out the welcome mat. You have, obviously, you have the sanctuary cities who are suffering the most by this, by the way, who have put out the biggest welcome mat, and now they're regretting that.
Yeah.
So
good point,
clearly we have to win the election. In the meantime, we have to use all of our leverage that we can to deny 60 votes whenever we have the opportunity to make some changes. But we can do a lot more on both on the Veteran Affairs Committee as well as the Banking Committee, because remember, banking has housing and urban development as well, and we just need to focus on that particular population.
Senator, we'll be watching your work. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Maria.